The DSM-5 has added a new diagnosis called prolonged grief disorder, meaning that individuals who have experienced a loss and showing symptoms of depression can now be diagnosed to be treated with psychotherapy and medication. The criteria emphasizes that the death occurred at least 1 year ago of a person who was close to the bereaved. Since the death, there had been extreme grief responses nearly every day or very often, such as intense longing for the deceased and preoccupation with thoughts of the deceased. In addition, there must be symptoms including identity disruption, marked sense of disbelief about the death, avoidance of reminders that the person is dead, intense emotional pain, difficulty with reintegration into life, emotional numbness, intense loneliness, and feelings that life is meaningless. Finally, the duration and severity must exceed the expected cultural, religious, and social norms of the person. Although there are some benefits, medicalizing grief has turned a human response to a tragedy into a medical disorder that requires intervention. There are many consequences at stake. First, it puts unrealistic expectations on people, telling them how they should grieve and for how long, which puts a pressure to meet a deadline for something that is different for everyone. Secondly, turning grief into a pathology means a response is medication, which can include antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs, and sleeping pills. The final consequence is the pressure that people are facing as they are told that they need to engage in counseling to handle their grief. Although this works for some, people grieve in different ways and should practice grieving in ways that feel comfortable, rather than feeling like they need to be cured. In our society, it is more normalized for women to express their emotions, and this social context in which we live profoundly influences the way that their grief is treated. Even though men and women may be equally distraught by a loss, they may express their emotions in different ways. Because women are more likely to express their grief to others rather than keep it hidden, it increases the likelihood of a formal diagnosis for disorders like depression and complicated grief. Intersectionality matters in all living contexts, including how grief is experienced. A study revealed that the prevalence rate of those diagnosed with complicated grief was 13% among low-income participants compared to a 3.5% prevalence rate for those of a higher income. Sheffy 2024 states, "We are not being taught to acknowledge loss, to reach out, and to show empathy and understanding." A woman named Justine lost her husband when he was 44 years old. When being interviewed by CBC, she didn't believe that she would meet the criteria for prolonged grief disorder, but she was surprised to find that the criteria was broader than she thought.
In a sense, if these criteria you would say yes to a year after Stuart's death. Intense yearning, longing for the deceased person.
Yes.
And preoccupation with thoughts or memories of the deceased person.
I'm going to say of course.
Intense emotional pain, anger, bitterness, sorrow related to the death.
Can I say duh? Like, of course you're having all those things. But they're a normal reaction. The biggest fear I have of someone being given that diagnosis is that they'll feel like something's wrong with them. They'll feel like they're not grieving right, that their experience isn't normal.
The takeaway from this info reel is that grief is a part of life, but the experiences are diverse and they are socially informed by what is deemed appropriate depending on one's identity. Be empathetic with the people that are grieving and don't put a time limit on their mourning.